I'm just going to open my document. Okay, so hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Like Michelle said, my name is Amanda and I am the Marketing and Community Engagement Manager at Cornerstone Counseling. If you run into technical issues during today's presentation, please use the chat function and I will do my best to assist you. Like Michelle mentioned, we will be recording today's session, but we are not keeping the chat. So if there's anything in there that you want to grab, just feel free to do that. But we just note we will also send a follow-up email after the session with a few resources. So you may be able to see some of those chat items in that follow-up email. Today, we will be discussing trauma-informed leadership. This webinar is intended as educational information rather than a replacement for medical advice or training. We will be offering general advice about leadership in the workplace and at home, and teach you a bit about how to approach trauma in a healthy, constructive, and supportive way. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the land on which we live, work, and prosper is Treaty 6 territory, the ancestral and traditional meeting grounds and gathering place for the Cree, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Métis, Dene, and Nakota Sioux. We acknowledge the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit whose footsteps have marked these lands for generations, and we are grateful for the traditional knowledge keepers and elders. We recognize the land as an act of reconciliation and gratitude to those whose territory we reside and gather on today. So I'd like to now introduce our first presenter. Alex is a registered psychologist and has been counseling at Cornerstone since January 2021. She works with adults, couples, and families who are struggling with various issues, including anxiety, depression, and trauma. One of the things she loves most about counseling is the privilege that comes through sitting with courageous individuals every day. If you are interested in pursuing counseling with Alex, please visit our website, which is www.cornerstonecounseling.com. Our second presenter today is Michelle, the owner of Creating People Power. She is a certified CMHA psychological health and safety advisor and DISC certified. She is an accomplished facilitator passionate about fostering respectful workplaces and helping business professionals become better leaders. If you are interested in working with Michelle, please visit www.creatingpeoplepower.ca. And I'm so excited to share that we have a special guest joining us today. Corby is a CPHR, a certified executive coach, and EFT master trainer and chartered professional in human resources, specializing in dialing up the courage in every soul she meets one tap at a time. And you guys will learn more about what that means in this webinar. Armed with humor and expert strategies, she's not just coaching, she's turning professional growth into an adventure. And Corby's contact email and phone number will be at the end of this webinar. So with that, Michelle, Alex, and Corby, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Amanda. And like you, I am over the moon delighted to have Corby joining Alex and I today. If you logged into one of our webinars before, you'll know that this isn't just an opportunity for us to share some of our experience and knowledge. We would love for you to share your experiences using Menti. So Menti is a tool that we use creating people power in our workshops to help provide a safe environment where people can anonymously submit ideas, feedback. So you can either open another browser and put menti.com in the browser and put in this secret code that is just going to be used for our webinar. So if you're watching this recording, sorry, you won't get to submit your answers. Or if you're savvy enough, you can just scan the QR code and it'll take you right there on your phone. So you will have an opportunity to participate. Amanda has also put that in the chat. If you're familiar with Menti and sort of our approach to training, welcome. And if you're not, we thought we would just sort of start off with a bit of a question related to the topic, which sort of get a vibe for our audience. What does trauma-informed leadership mean to you? And as soon as you type your response and hit submit, it will show up on the screen. So we have someone who's really quick at typing, compassion, and it will kind of be nice to see what perspectives we get, whether it be from your experience, your knowledge level, maybe around the topic. So, yes, being a supportive and understanding leader, that's very nice. Being aware of what others bring, being a supportive leader and understanding what others struggle with, absolutely. Working with teammates in a compassionate way. Uh, Understanding that there are past experiences that impact today's behavior. A calming presence and listener, self-awareness. Slow to react with judgment, curious to understand. One of mine and Corby's favorite words, curiosity. Learning about mental wellness and being open. Oh, this is a great start. So accommodation. Thank you. So let's dive into really what a definition of trauma-informed leadership is. And if you didn't answer this question because you don't know, that's completely okay. We're here to talk a little bit about what it is and how you as a leader can come into your role with a trauma-informed approach. We're also really hearing more conversation around the importance of it in a workplace, so we'll address that and provide you with some examples. And really, one of our key takeaways was that we would see some compassionate leadership in action. So to all those of you who have logged in or are watching this webinar, thank you for caring about this topic. All right, so what is it? Let's give the definition. I guess it sort of depends on what school of thought you start with. I will share with you that this really is a strength-based approach. So trauma-informed leadership, as many people had said, seeks to really understand and respond to the impact of trauma that someone may have experienced. And we'll talk a little bit in the next slide about different types of trauma, but it is this approach that is understanding that some form of trauma may affect the behavior that we have right now and into the future. It can definitely help, and we'll talk about this from a leadership standpoint, leaders having empathy and compassion, and those are words that you'll hear us talk a lot about. So let's dive into a definition of trauma. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this. If there's a big interest in it, maybe it's a future webinar, but I think we want to conceptualize and give people an understanding of what trauma means, because it might mean different things to different people. And I'm going to turn this over to Alex, I believe, to just sort of give some context around trauma.
Absolutely. And you're so right, Michelle. We all have our different sort of understandings of what this means. From a psychology perspective, we often talk about this first bullet point of the difference between big T and little t traumas. And so often when trauma is mentioned, we think of PTSD, which is a very significant condition that results from experiencing trauma. And we'll often talk about big T versus little t. So big T traumas are sort of the big traumas that come to mind when you hear that word. So living through like a hurricane, a tornado, some kind of global weather impact, being in a big accident, those types of things. Little traumas are maybe smaller micro incidents that happen over our lifetime and over time, and those can still accumulate to have significant impact on somebody. And again, we won't go into it too much, but this is kind of where the new term complex PTSD or CPTSD has come in to kind of fit and encapsulate that. For those of us that haven't experienced a big T, we can still have some symptoms of trauma. The impact is also really unique person to person, and it can vary based on, your genetics, the environment in which you were raised in, the cortisol levels that you just naturally have, and life experiences. So for some people, and you'll notice that when you're maybe watching a biography or the news, there are some people that go through a major accident and seem to come out unscathed and really don't have a lot of mental or physical impact. And there's some people who are very opposite and might have a lot of impact in those areas. And so there's no shame in how trauma impacts each of us. I think it's just really important to drive home the unique way person to person because of those reasons. Some of the consequences too of not dealing with trauma and leaving it unresolved, which I know we'll talk a little bit further about and how you might see this come into the workplace. But some consequences include one that really comes to mind, the relational impact. Trauma impacts the way that we understand the world and we understand other people. And so it might impact someone's openness to building new relationships. It might impact relationships that they already have with family and friends. It can impact our self-esteem. There are a lot of psychological symptoms that one might experience. So becoming more rigid, needing to have a lot of control. There's also a lot more research these days about the physical impact of trauma, which can include, headaches, difficulties with sleeping, insomnia. I know in a previous webinar, we had talked about like gut health issues, migraines. There's all sorts of physical ways that trauma can start to manifest within our body. I know too that I believe Corby might have had some additions to kind of the physical impact, if I hadn't covered them.
Yeah, it just, as you said, chronic fatigue can be muscle tension, pain, digestive issues. Yeah, all of that you've talked about, and it can be that burnout, that brain fog, just aggravation at things that seem out of proportion, so it can have a lot of impact on those kind of areas of our life that we are attributing to what's going on, or what has gone on.
So well said, Corby. Yeah, lots of impact and long-standing impact too. If we go over just to our next slide, we're going to bring you back into Menti. We're curious to see what you believe are the different forms of trauma that persons might experience.
This was really just to get some insight and awareness, both from an audience perspective and just really an understanding. Okay, so maybe was it a trick question then? Everybody's answering all of the above. I love it. Okay, so absolutely, right? There are many different forms of trauma, which again, we're not going to go into today, but just making sure that there's an understanding that trauma can come from many places. And really, we wanted to highlight the fact that, you may or may not be aware of the fact of how trauma has affected you in your life. But I would say the presence of trauma, based on the research that we did, is very common, right? There are a large number of us that have experienced some form of trauma, whether we've defined it and it was a big T or a little t. Research shows actually that 2/3 of Canadian adults have been exposed to some form of traumatic event. So 1 in 4 women has experienced domestic violence, and 1 in 4 children experiences some form of maltreatment. So whether that be physical abuse, sexual or emotional abuse in their development years, that form of trauma can have a very big impact. Thank you. Amanda has put the sources for that research if you're interested. We also wanted to sort of look at very different demographic groups. For example, it was actually difficult to find the effect of trauma on men. Or when we look at different groups, like an LGBTQ2S plus group, much of that hasn't been researched and or documented really widespread, at least not from a Canadian standpoint. But the point here is, regardless of how you may identify or with what group, there is trauma prevalent in every one of our lives. So having that understanding can then help us, ideally through therapy and through some of the conversation that you might have with friends and family, work through some of it. What our focus today is to talk about how that might impact you as you show up in the community, in our workplaces, with the people that we live and spend time with. So Alex, I don't know if you want to expand sort of on this ripple effect, but I think the visual really clearly represents the experiences that people might have and how it can impact them.
I think you described that perfectly, Michelle. Yeah, just kind of reinforcing that this incident is not isolated and it doesn't stay isolated. It can impact so many facets of our lives and widespread impact to other people and areas in which might have been like safe for us. You know, our work might have been safe, our communities might have been safe, but now this kind of sneaks in and starts to disrupt some of the spaces and places that we occupy. So I loved this image that Michelle included of the ripples and the waves. And go ahead if anybody had anything to add to that too.
Yeah, it's never just an isolated, effect to ourselves, which often we think it is, and when we hold it to ourselves, we're still hurting ourselves and everyone else, by not freeing us from that experience.
Absolutely.
And I know, when we have conversations around respectful workplaces, we focus a lot on behavior. And sometimes we don't even recognize some of the behaviors that we have that may impact others. And, those behaviors might be a result of the trauma that we have experienced. So, tying this to behaviors and conversations, we just here really wanted to highlight this ripple effect and hopefully help people work through it. So we do want to talk a little bit about the chemical reaction because, as Alex alluded to earlier, and Corby's going to get into a little bit more, there is a physical element that takes place in your body. And Alex, I know that you're well versed in this, so help us understand the chemical reactions.
I will try to put it as succinctly as possible. I know we're not here for a neuroscience workshop, but if I'm to describe it in a summary, the first piece that we always talk about, and you've heard a little bit so far today, is around the hormone that's released called cortisol. So we all experience cortisol release. We call it nature's alarm system. And it was really beneficial, 200 years ago, when we were hunters gatherers, way even before that, because our bodies do need to know when to turn on that fight, flight, or freeze system, which a lot of people might be familiar with those words. Unfortunately, if you experience a lot of trauma in your life, or your cortisol might be elevated and you may be more quick to experience that response and fight, flight, or freeze. So that is sort of one of the concerns with cortisol. Cortisol is not entirely bad, though. We need it and it's useful. Similarly, oxytocin, kind of on the other side of cortisol, we call it the happy hormone. Oxytocin is that hormone released when you give someone a hug, when we smile at another person, when we laugh, the bonding hormone that happens between parents and their children. It's the hormone that makes us feel safe and comforted. And unfortunately, again, when we experience trauma, we might be very removed from experiencing that hormone. In our third point, one of the issues becomes when our system is chronically under stress, when we have chronic cortisol racing through, we potentially push ourselves into the area of experiencing burnout. And might not just be burnout in the workplace, that could be burnout in our home space and relationships. And I know we had a webinar a while back talking about burnout that might link well here. And the last piece, which I know Corby's actually going to describe a little better how our body responds in some of these systems in the next slide. But the last piece is just mentioning how do we regulate when our bodies go into these areas. And again, that could be an entire webinar in and of itself, and I might encourage you to look back at our stress management or anxiety webinars that have some really good tips. We're also going to talk a little bit later about ways to regulate, to ground oneself when we're feeling some of that trauma response coming in and when the stress hormones are coming in as well. So I might leave it at that. Does anybody have anything to add or chime in before I turn it over to Corby?
No, it's good. I think it fits well into here.
Yeah.
When we talk about window of tolerance, so this is what happens when the chemical alarms go off and different things like that. When we get activated or into our fight or flight, which is a hyperarousal state, our window of tolerance, which is how much capacity we have to manage things on a day, gets shrunk up. And then we're into that, I have to get out, I have to get away. We start feeling things like anxiety, panic attacks. It's that running, I need to get away. When we're in the opposite, we're in the freeze zone, which is our capacity is still shrinking, right? We become numb and frozen, and it becomes that hopeless, depressed state at the very bottom of it. But the thing is, when trauma happens, we get stuck in either a fight or flight or the freeze zone, because our normal everyday is we are in and out of hyperarousal and hypoarousal every day. And that's a healthy way, because if we have to, like, if we want to go jogging, we want that energy of that fight and flight energy to be with us, to move. Or if we've got a big project and we're really excited about it, we're moving into that energy. And to the opposite is if when we want to get into a meditative state, we want to get into that hypoarousal state. We want to be able to calm ourselves, to be able to take things in. So a normal fluctuation is we're always in the flow of this, in and out of this window. But the problem is in trauma, we get stuck in it. And so that's what we want to be aware of. And as Alex had said, with complex trauma too, we can be in both states, in the hyper and hypo at the same time. So that's very hard on our nervous system, and it takes a lot of energy. So when we can understand that, like, our nervous system will get aroused and into these different states naturally, but it's when we're chronically in it that creates the problem.
I'm so happy, Corby, that you explained the importance of that movement actually being healthy, that it's good for us,
Yes.
and understanding. Because right now people are thinking, I didn't know I was coming to a science webinar.
Yeah.
I thought we were going to be talking about leadership. And we are. But
Yeah.
part of the reason this is so important is because if we aren't aware of what's taking place, not only in our own bodies, or what could potentially be happening to, as Alex said, people that we live with or people that we work with, that then becomes a real challenge. So we're curious, how aware do you think your team, so whether you want to define your team as maybe the people you live with or the people you work with for this context, how aware do you think that your team is about the effects of trauma? So we might have some people here that are first responders, for example. I have some clients that are first responders. They are, I would say, very aware of the effects of trauma and have conversations a lot about trauma. But, I might deal with someone like an accountant or a lawyer who also has experienced trauma and may be experiencing traumas in their life or at work, but maybe aren't as acutely aware of how much that does affect the way we show up at work. So, okay, sort of average. That's actually higher than I would have predicted. I'm really happy to see that. So maybe, we've attracted what I'll refer to as like an educated audience, people who are already familiar with the topic. And that's great. This is just a great question to have if you want to dive into this topic. So why are we having this conversation? Why is it important? Why are people talking about this now? Because as you may know, this isn't a new term. It has been around for a while, but it does, I think, really connect to the fact that we're having more and more conversations about wellness at work, about how we show up at work. And again, people are bringing their whole selves to work. We don't, despite what people may have thought in the past, leave our home life at home, get in our car, drive to work. Hi, this is work me. And then we, leave our work me at work and we go home like that. We're not a light switch. That doesn't happen. So this stress and any trauma that we may be in the process of experiencing or have experienced in the past shows up in the way in which we behave with others and as leaders. So the elements really of a trauma-informed workplace is tied very closely to, I would say, much of the work that I do, and we'll talk about that later because it ties also to the work that Alex and Corby do, where we're really bringing this sense of belonging and connection. And, when we are looking at productive and collaborative teams, these are important elements we have with people are tied directly to those concepts. So whether you're having conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging, whether we're having conversations around respectful workplace, or whether we're even having a one-on-one performance management conversation with an individual, having a trauma-informed lens, in my opinion, will foster deeper connections, not just for individuals in the workplace, but also for our teams. So we thought this might be a really good place, since we've introduced the concept, to sort of share what each of our different perspectives are. And Corby's also going to be sharing a strategy that you can use from a sort of a stress tolerance as we go forward. So I'm giving you a bit of a, hey, here it comes information. But Alex, why don't we talk a little bit about your perspective and, your thoughts on trauma-informed leadership and the way it impacts or sort of what you see in your work.
Absolutely, yeah. I think it's something that comes up quite often. I don't know why I'm surprised by that, but I've been surprised to hear so much conversation with clients about what it is to be an employee in a workplace that's not trauma informed. I think a lot of folks, of course, are coming to therapy. It's much less stigmatized now, and people are really doing the work to understand how their trauma shows up in these different areas and trying to minimize that impact. But I still see folks who are being very courageous, trying to bring in their bosses or their colleagues into a better understanding of themselves. I still see some disconnect there, some resistance, and how that can really harm and hurt people. And so I guess in saying that, I might just encourage folks, if someone is really being courageous and brave and bringing forward how their trauma or their mental health impacts their ability to be at work and maybe the accommodations that they might need, maybe try to take a step back and be very compassionate and mindful of how hard that actually is to do, and how great that is. They want to be a better, more effective employee, likely. So that's sort of what I see behind the scenes.
Appreciate that, Alex. Corby, how about your perspective? And maybe this would be a good place to talk a little bit about what Amanda alluded to in the introduction, the work that you do with EFT, and I'll let you define that for people who may not be familiar with the term.
Yeah, and I love the idea of this trauma-informed leadership, but I also think, a lot of people get afraid of that word. And so to my mind, it's like we just need to know the nervous system health and regulation, because each one of us will go through that window of tolerance, like I said before. And so when we get activated and we're in those fight, flight, or freeze modes, our brain is not online, right? We think we are. And when we're under chronic stress, we're using up a lot of energy to be in our workplace, to do things that we do, so that when we go home, as you said, Michelle, we don't turn off that switch. We're exhausted by the time we get home, because we have to put up so much energy to hold this capacity of this chronic stress. And so when we can understand that as leaders, as workplace, then we can, have some compassion, get some connection, and understand is how do we work with somebody so that we can get them to a regulated spot where their window of tolerance opens up, right? So that they're in this more receptive place, because when we are activated in chronic stress all the time, we don't have the ability to actually hear and see the way that we need to be able to hear and see and function in a workplace. You know, we get it done, but the end result is a lot of sick time, a lot of burnout. You know, there's a big cost, human cost, that happens at the end of it. So when we can see it as, yeah, this is nervous system health and we all go through this. And even if we say, well, I haven't had a trauma, but if we're in this chronic overload, eventually we'll be traumatized at some point along that journey. So it's like, yeah, so we want to protect the longevity, and which then affects the you know, bottom line of the company.
I'm so glad that you raised that point, Corby, about something like workload and this constant, you know, feeling like you have too much work, you can't manage your workload. I mean, we talk about it all the time in psychological safety, but that in the way those things affect our nervous system is so important. I know also in the work that I do, when we are talking about, you know, respectful workplaces, oftentimes, as I said before, we have conversations around behavior. And sometimes when someone goes through this process of understanding that their behavior might be hurtful or have a hurtful effect on someone, that is an awareness piece. But there's also awareness and understanding for those people that we work with. So if someone's working on their individual behavior, they might look at me and say, oh, well, I mean, I know Michelle's trying, but she's always been like this. She's probably not going to change. So there's also a question around, how are we supporting that person in making the change? Even things like that can cause stress, and anxiety is some of the things that I've seen in people when they are trying to make changes and aren't being accepted. There's that whole element of acceptance that we talk about in the workplace. So when we come from a place of curiosity, when we come from a place of trying to understand the way in which our experiences have affected us and show up at work, I think we can then move to a place where, regardless of whether you're in a leadership role, I think this is one of the messages before I hand it over, is we want to make sure that people understand you have the ability to influence your workplace. Regardless of what role you play, if you lead a team, then obviously you can lead by example, but even as an individual, as Alex had said, you might be able to bring something forward. We have an awareness questionnaire, not developed by us. I'm happy to share that in the webinar, post-webinar information, but even just promoting trauma awareness, having conversations, inviting your team to watch a segment of this webinar at your next team meeting and talk about, have a conversation, an open conversation around how we hold trauma, what trauma we might have experienced, depending on the relationship, obviously, that you have with your team. And most importantly, you know, or as importantly, being aware of the pressures that we're putting on other people. I understand there are some industries that are, you know, deadline oriented, and if you work in an ER, you some of those pressures you can't control, but there might be other elements of your work that you can control, and having an open conversation about the effect on people would be really, really helpful. We also, I will endorse this every day of the week, 24/7, top-down leadership support of conversations of this nature truly do have a huge impact. So if you are watching and you have the opportunity as a leader in your organization to promote this awareness, have these conversations, and, you know, quite frankly, be brave enough. Some people think, well, this isn't a conversation for the workplace. It is a conversation for the workplace. We spend so much time together at work, and understanding and what people might need, so important. If you've been on a webinar with me before, I don't know if anyone else wants to talk about the circle of control. I still have mine on my cork board right above my computer. It's a great visual reminder for me. I first printed it out when my kids were little, as a way of helping them regulate and sort of understand what are things that I can control. what are things that are out of my control. And I find that for me, the word that Corby uses a lot is regulate. So it helps me to be able to regulate and sort of let go of some of my stress when I realize, oh, you know, who likes me is not within my circle of control, and just sort of letting some of those things go. So I still have this laminated circle of control here. And then obviously I've already referred to, but just creating this conversation around psychological safety. We see it in almost every province now in Canada. The conversation around psychologically safe workplaces, and it's in our occupational health and safety legislation. So we're seeing more and more policies around that. And it would be important, and maybe this is one approach. Maybe this is one way that you have conversation around trauma-informed leadership, is by taking it under the umbrella of psychological safety. So those are just some ideas and strategies. If you want to bring this conversation forward as a leader or maybe within your workplace. Alex and Corby, do you have anything to add from like that perspective? I'm going to share an example from a client, I think a little bit later, but I want to make sure we have time for Corby to do the stress reduction exercise. Because now I've worked everybody up about all these things we're going to talk about at work. I'm hoping that Corby, we can help them. So I had the pleasure of working with Corby and getting a better sense of emotional freedom technique. And unfortunately, it was not a pleasurable time in my life. I'm forever grateful for Corby to reach out to me and say, Michelle, would you be willing to try this? Because I will fully disclose that I came into this with a closed mind, Corby. I think I was not convinced that emotional freedom technique was right for me, but I was very ill physically to the point where I almost couldn't walk. And Corby approached me on the right day and said, would you be willing to try it? And because I have such a trusting relationship with her, I can truly say it changed my life. So I'm excited for her to sort of give you some insight and offer you sort of a really brief idea for ways that you might be able to reduce stress in your life if you're feeling some of those moments of overwhelm.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. Yeah, and to tell you the truth, when I first was introduced to it too, I was like, what the heck have I got myself into? It was all good.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I'm just going to teach everyone a very simple technique. So what EFT or emotional freedom techniques is a way to help. We're actually working on the energy system in our body, which is where the traumas and things are stored in our body. And so what we're going to do is actually just squeeze on either side of our fingers. And what this is doing is all our energy systems run along the tops of our fingers up to our arms and to our brain. So as we start squeezing here, it starts to send the signal to the amygdala in our brain, and this is very simplified now, to start to bring calming back in, to bring our frontal cortex back online here. Because when we're in that fight or flight or freeze, this is the way to start bringing us back, opening that window of tolerance. So this can be done anytime you're feeling stressed, anytime, like when I've got to go give a speech somewhere, I'll be tapping. I have executives that underneath the table, they're squeezing their fingers. This is so easy to do because this is a natural thing that our body already does. You know, we bite our fingers, we'll tap them with pencils, we'll squeeze them anyways. So I can do this, hold it like this, and I'm squeezing all my fingers. Nobody knows I'm doing this. Often when I'm walking, I'll just use it on one side, one-handed. I can walk, nobody knows I'm doing this. So our body is always looking for ways to help reduce our stress level. Now we're just bringing a conscious lens to it to help it a little bit faster. So this is quite easy. You know, when you start trying it, just take a pulse of what is my stress level right now and just start squeezing for a few minutes. They've done tests like if you're afraid to go to the dentist, say, and you just start squeezing your fingers in less than, you know, not even 5 minutes, your stress anxiety levels reduced by 40%. So, I mean, it's great because it's got scientific data. So I encourage you, just try this. You know, do it under your desk, do it wherever. I've had big construction guys come and he's like, I had to go to my truck. I squeezed my fingers and I got calm and then I could go and talk to my guys, right? So he's already using the technique, and which is really trauma informed, because now he can come with a regulated nervous system to his employees, which will then also create a calming effect. Because if somebody's already jacked up on this fight or flight, and you got this high energy, it affects everybody's nervous system, and it'll affect it differently. But if we as leaders can come in on a more grounded, energetic level, that also has that ripple effect. So it's important. So yeah, give it a try. It seems weird, but it's easy to do, and it's always with you. So you're always empowered with it.
I love that, Corby. There was an endorsement for EFT in the chat, someone
Oh,
who's
good.
used it. And yeah, so I guess it's about having an open mind, and we'll talk about a few other strategies. We're not going to go through all of them. We thought what might be nice is to just sort of put a chart of things that you can look at and say, okay, what is something that might work either for me, or maybe you're recognizing some of this and there's something that you could do in your workplace. And I'm going to give one example that I was so moved by a client who has this strategy, and I wanted to share it with you or a colleague. And I'll have Alex and Corby speak too. If you've ever dined in Beaumont at Chartier Restaurant, and I do have permission to share this story, by the way, from Sylvia. So their organization truly believes in supporting mental health. And if you've ever worked in a restaurant, which I have not, but I know people who have, it can be a very stressful environment, and it is very difficult work, long hours, really requires, like, that is the epitome of teamwork, working in a restaurant. Everything is connected. And one of the things that I was really moved that they do at Chartier is they start off every shift with one word. And so every employee says one word, and it's sort of about like how you're feeling or what's going on. You don't need to explain it. You can if you want, but it just sort of gives everybody a vibe for, this is how I'm showing up at work today, right? You might be super happy because the sun is shining. You just had a beautiful walk with your dog. So I'm going to say happy. Or, I might have had some struggles with one of my kids this morning, or, the loss of a pet. And so I can say sad. And what Sylvia explains it does is it really just gives a means to understand your starting point and how we can best support each other as coworkers. She also shared with me that there are times where they've printed, and you will have seen this in our webinars before, the wheel of emotions, or a big list of emotions, so that sometimes, when we see a word, we can point at it. We maybe can't quite think of it, like when our brain is full and the chemicals, or whether it be cortisol or oxytocin, right? So to just sort of have that word and be able to pick it. So I wanted to share that because I think it's such a great way to role model what trauma-informed leadership looks like. It's not just the things that we've experienced in the past. It's, what just happened to you on your way to work, those few hours before the day that might be affecting the way in which you show up. Thank you, Amanda, for sharing Chartier's website. That is super nice. Any other examples or stories that someone might want to share about, whether it be sort of in this chart? I know we talked about routine, and boy, the parents of young children out there, you're probably going to really appreciate this. So routine, even for adults, can be a way of creating safety for someone in a workplace and helping them understand. That's why we always talk about clarity of communication, clarity of expectations. And I know, Alex, you can really relate to this as a young mom. Corby, did you have something to add?
Yeah, just when we were talking about routines and things, I had a client after the pandemic, like she is a person who has complex trauma. But so when she came, when the edict to come back to work and be in groups again, set off a lot of her anxiety and stuff. So she had to make a plan with the employer, and that is she had to have a safe person so that when she was in a crowd and she could tell that, this is overwhelming for me, so that I could leave. She had to be close to the exit so that she didn't feel trapped. So it's like, how do we accommodate what the person needs at that time so that they can feel safe? And when it's too much, they know they have the okay to exit and then catch up later, or regulate themselves. So it's very important so that we know we have safe people, that we have a plan, so that they feel empowered, and that goes a long way.
Appreciate that. She's lucky to have a supportive workplace that would allow her to share that and do that. Yeah, I love that. I do see a lot more, and these can be really small behaviors too, in meetings where people, or I know we do it all the time in our workshops, where you have the ability to stand. We don't have to sit for this 1 hour meeting. We can stand, we can move, we can step out. We're adults, we know what our body needs. And helping people understand that does create a more trauma-informed workplace. And if you have ideas, like, heads up, we're going to be asking you to share some near the end, so you can, we'll put those in Menti and we'll share those out with people. Any other strategies, Alex, that you've maybe recommended to clients?
It's similar to the word of centering, but definitely grounding. I know tapping is a technique similar to that too, but using your senses to ground. And just as you're starting to feel yourself escalate, just scanning your environment, listening for sounds. Even we'll talk about like chewing cinnamon gum or having sour candy in your desk. Those kind of shocks to the system, it makes it very hard for us to stay in the emotion center of the brain. So kind of forces you to come out of that. But grounding, and then I also love, from a leadership perspective, the using people's strengths. Our brains are just primed to naturally look for the negatives as threats in the environment. But instead of, what is this person not able to do? What do I know they can do well? And how can we pull that in and encourage and foster that to help, our bottom line and what we do here in the workspace? So really focusing on strengths.
And sometimes we need people to help us remind us of our strengths. Yes. We can be our own worst enemy, as we know, that self-talk that we do. And you have experienced, as well as Corby, when we do DISC assessments, that it does highlight our strengths, right? That's a self-assessment that you have submitted. So it's good to highlight that and have others. I remember being part of a team, and when I think back to it now, we probably didn't call it trauma-informed. It was a little bit of a different strategy where we used to complement each other's work. So throughout the week, you would observe something that your coworker did, and then you would come to the weekly meeting the next week and you would compliment. And so people would say to me, well, doesn't that become sort of superficial? You're like, oh, I saw Corby buy someone coffee. No, it not in my experience. It became people heightened their observations and awareness of what other people were doing in the workplace, and being able to articulate it and hear something about yourself and understand the impact that behavior had on others was very powerful. And even, in a team of, I think, 10 people, the exercise took maybe 5 minutes. So there are really small things that we can do to sort of promote this trauma informed and just being curious. So this is not really like sort of a destination. I would say it's like if you're an organization that is embracing diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging, and you've developed a strategy and you have sort of set your direction, this is very similar. Like, there's no end point, like there's no end of the road. These are sort of ongoing conversations and concepts. And I just really want everyone here today to understand that regardless of your role in the organization, you have the ability to influence this, whether it be bringing it forth in a meeting, requesting a conversation, leading by example. I mean, even if your whole team doesn't want to do that exercise, you can do it individually. And promoting awareness. So raising awareness about different concepts. We'll share some really great books. Some of you here have probably already read some of them. I think The Body Keeps Score is probably the one that gets the most rave reviews. And at work, it's about really fostering safety. So understanding when someone needs a safe place and what they need for that safe place at work might be different from you, and giving people choices. I know at the very beginning when we had asked people, what does trauma-informed leadership mean to you? Someone had written accommodation. And sometimes it does mean making choices for different people. Most people will know that I have a standing desk, and it has probably been one of the best additions to my life over the past 10 years. I do sometimes sit down, but that ability to be able to move for me, I have recognized really, really impacts the way in which my brain learns and works. So those are, just some examples of accommodations and choices. Anything to add, ladies, before I move on? All right, so now we want to hear from you. We would love to know, based on what you learned today, or maybe what your organization is doing right now, what are some strategies that you might be willing to try? Is it, taking your fingers and practicing that little stress reduction, and instead of doing it under the table, maybe you do it right in front of everybody so that someone says, Michelle, what are you doing? And I can tell you, I'm trying to relieve my stress from what we're talking about in this meeting. Or, right, maybe there's more subtle things that you think you can do. So again, we'd love your ideas. We've tried to bring forth our different experiences, but if there's things that your organization does and you would love to share with others, remember, Menti is completely anonymous, so you can share your concepts and ideas. I know that at this point, some people are like, oh no, I logged out of Menti. I didn't think we were using it. You can also put it in the chat if that's easier. We just don't save the chat. So yeah. We are almost out of time. We'd be happy to answer any questions. If people want to type them into the chat, we're open for that. Oh, love that. Being aware of yourself and your staff. Yes. More intentionally checking in, focusing on team strengths. Ooh, 3 deep breaths. I have recently learned the importance of breathing. Like not just generally, but just the importance of deep breaths. Obviously, more open conversations. Yeah, I have one last experience to share with you. If we'll give people some time. Yay! You're gonna try the EFT. Good for you. Good for you, sharing your ADHD diagnosis at the age of 48. Yeah, some of us didn't even get diagnosed until that age, right? So understanding and learning about how that impacts us. Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate that, because it does affect how you show up. So if you have any questions, feel free to put them into the chat. I will share sort of this one example that a client had, and they do it for their town hall meetings. And one of the things they do is the meeting starts at 10, and you can log in 10 minutes before. If you have that desire for social time, they actually have someone who plays music, so it's kind of like a good atmosphere vibe. You can just check in with your coworkers. For those of you that still have a lot of remote workers, it's a great way to create some connection. But then at 10 o'clock, the meeting starts and they ride. So right, so you're sort of giving these options for people to have a casual check-in and still honoring those that might have the schedule. It's little things like that that can really create some impact. One word in Slack to start the day. Love it. There's a question: any tips on working with leaders who aren't bought into psych safety? Let's say their perspectives are a bit dated. Oh, Josh, I really appreciate you for phrasing it that way. That's so nice. So any tips on working with leaders who aren't bought into psych safety? I mean, I have some, but Corby?
Yeah, it's tough because it's the conversations need to happen, and it has to happen from the top, and a lot won't be open to it because a lot of time they're having issues with things that are going on and aren't allowing them to be open with it. So yeah, that's a tough one.
Mm-hmm. It is a tough one. From my experience, and some people might sort of roll their eyes at this, but I've worked with a lot of construction and industrial clients, and it's in our legislation, right? We've been doing respectful workplace work for many years, long before we had legislation, and Aaron just nailed it in the chat. We can tie it to people's physical safety. So if the way I show up at work does not have me focused on the job, in particular, if I'm in a safety sensitive environment, that now impacts not only myself, but the people that I'm working with. And maybe I'm more sensitive to that since I just spent a couple of hours yesterday listening to a webinar from a law firm on occupational health and safety, and some of the penalties and fines that are coming through for organizations and supervisors who aren't taking psych safety seriously. So I love the concept of helping people understand both from a mental health standpoint and or a safety standpoint. And again, sorry, tying it to the legislation, right? I mean, there's a requirement for us to have policies that address the support we give to coworkers, both physical and mental. So maybe your health and safety route. Yeah. Any other questions before we let people go? So Amanda is furiously tossing some great resources into the chat. Thank you so much. I put this slide up so that you could scan the QR code. And there are some books that some of us have read and would endorse as other options. We'll send this out to you after the webinar. And just some additional resources that we want to leave you with. And I think I'd like to turn it over to Amanda now. While I see there's some really great points, how to make sure that some people will not take advantage of you and your understanding. Oh, this is a great question that came through. Sorry, Amanda, before we just close off, we've got a couple minutes to address this question. I think, Aaron, you're right. I would not be surprised how many board members are not aware of the legislation, and we do need more awareness. It's probably one of the biggest reasons this community of colleagues that we have continues with these webinars, is we feel that every person who has the conversation is curious enough to do it. Can we address that question? How do we make sure people do not take advantage of your understanding? Alex, would you be willing to address that?
Absolutely. I think that's a really good question. And the thing that comes to mind is that we're still in our understanding, we're allowed to have boundaries. Because I know I can hear, some people, well, I have blank, and so I'm allowed to be this way at work. No, there's still boundaries. There's still ways that we all need to respect and behave towards each other. There's even still our responsibilities and duties that we have to get done in a work day as well. And so some accommodation can be made, but it is a bit of that gray area of what is the boundary and where is the line of my understanding versus being taken advantage of. What are your thoughts, Michelle or Corby?
Alex, I feel like there isn't a webinar that goes by where you don't manage to bring in boundaries, and it is so important, not just at work, but at home, right? And acknowledging that this is what I need for my wellness, which sometimes, might be quiet, or sometimes might be conversation, or sometimes might be a note. So yeah, no, boundaries, love it. Good job, Alex. You got it in right at the last minute. Okay, Amanda, we don't want to go over time, so turn it over to you for the close. On behalf of everybody here, thank you so much to all of you who have logged in and shared your experiences and insights. So happy to have you here.
Yes, I echo that. And thank you three for such a great presentation. Even though we do this planning session, I feel like I learn something new every time you're actually doing the webinar. So thank you so much. So we do have a couple resources for you to look into if you are interested in learning a little bit more about any of these topics. The first one is hosted by Corby, and it's an introduction to emotional freedom techniques, and it's a webinar. So you can access that from wherever you are. And it starts October 1st, so it's coming up relatively quickly. Her email address will be on the next slide. At Cornerstone Counseling, we're offering our anger management workshop on October 24th and 26th. This is an in-person workshop, and you can learn about ways to understand your anger, what your triggers are, and then strategies to deal with those feelings. Next, mental health first aid. I have taken this course. I know Michelle has taken it. It is a life-changing opportunity to learn about various mental health challenges and how to support people who might be struggling. So I believe, Michelle, this is something that you guys are offering based on an individual basis. It's not class-based.
Yeah, there is actually open enrollment, but it is more often than not, I would say what we see companies doing is bringing it into their organizations and helping leaders have conversations around just recognizing different mental health ailments and, as importantly, having the conversation. You're right, Amanda, this changed my life, not just as someone who delivers respectful workplace work, but as a parent. It was very eye-opening, and we're super grateful to have Ryan on our team delivering mental health first aid. So yeah, if you're interested, you can reach out to any of us. And the self-regulation exercises, Amanda?
Yeah, so if you want to see a little bit more of Corby, you can scan that QR code under the video heading, and it's just 5 different self-regulation exercises that she guides you through. So lots of options here for everyone.
Okay, we're at time. Thanks for being with us, everyone. Have a great day. Stay safe.
Thank you. Bye.